9 out of the world's 10 most polluted cities are in India, 42 out of the top 50, and a mind boggling 83 of the top 100 polluted cities are in India. Given this dire situation, what is our government doing to fish us out of this mess? Because Hindu or Muslim, Ambani or Adivasi, this is an issue that affects us all. Let's find out more in this episode of Tree Talk. At the start, let me begin by saying that this is not an exhaustive report of the performance of the NDA government on all environmental matters. But this government has been in power for 10 years, and as it seeks another term in power, it is important to take stock of how it has fared on the environmental front. During the years I practiced as a lawyer in the Bombay High Court, I worked on a number of environmental cases. And today, as a writer and children's author, I have written a bunch of books about environmental matters and speak from this perspective as a lawyer, a writer, and a citizen. And I shall be focusing in this video on 10 points that have struck me as being particularly significant. In the development of language, there is a concept called semantic shift or semantic change. That is when one word, which has a certain meaning, begins to acquire a different meaning over a period of time. Let me give you an example. Today, when you use the word awful, what you mean is that something is terrible or horrible or unpleasant. But that is not what the word originally meant. The word was coined with the words awe and full, so it meant something that filled one with awe or wonder, that is something spellbinding or amazing, or what we describe today as awesome. A similar process is happening in India today. Words that were originally seen as describing something worthy, like liberal, intellectual, secular, activist, are now being painted in negative, unworthy colors. And words and concepts like climate change, attested to by scientists and experienced by us all, are being debunked. Take a look at this.
देखिए आज छोटे छोटे बालक भी क्लाइमेट चेंज और एनवायरनमेंट चेंज की चर्चा कर रहे हैं 70 80 85 90 साल के लोग तो सर्दियों में अगर आप देखेंगे तो अक्सर कहते हैं कि पिछली बार से इस बार सर्दी ज्यादा है ऐसा कहते हैं ना एक्चुअली सर्दी ज्यादा नहीं है उनकी उम्र बढ़ने के कारण उनकी सहने की शक्ति कम हो गई है वैसे ही ये क्लाइमेट चेंज नहीं हुआ है हम चेंज हो गए हैं हम लोग कुछ शब्दों से बड़े परिचित हैं श्रमजीवी बुद्धिजीवी ये सारे शब्दों से परिचित हैं लेकिन मैं देख रहा हूं कि पिछले कुछ समय से इस देश में एक नई जमात पैदा हुई है एक नई बिरादरी सामने आई है और वो है आंदोलन जीवी
Just like in the classic George Orwell book 1984, the intention here is to have future generations look upon climate change as a hoax and activism as a problem. Even a cursory glance at any book that speaks about India's environmental history makes it abundantly clear what an important role activists have played in safeguarding our land and our water, our forests and our wildlife, our mountains and our rivers. Taking these positive ideas and turning them into cuss words is messing with the mind and is an attempt to alter something at a fundamental level. Now, you may say that these remarks are casual and have no impact, that Modi has spoken about climate change at the COP28 climate summit in Dubai and on other occasions. In this context, I'd ask you to listen in to a Suno India Climate Emergency podcast where climate journalist Mayank Agarwal addresses the issue of climate misinformation at length. I've linked it up in the description below. One of the first measures brought in by this government was the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan way back in 2014. Over the years, the policy has had many positive goals, from creating open defecation-free villages to introducing better solid waste management plans. But pictures of celebrities posing with brooms apart, what the program managed to achieve was to put cleanliness and hygiene in the public consciousness of a lot of people. Matters like waste disposal and segregation became talking points. Now, I can attest to this from my own experience. I had been composting wet waste in my house from about 2008, and after a few neighbors began taking an interest, I started speaking to people in my building in an attempt to get more people to follow this at a larger scale. But I was met with a lot of resistance. Yet, after the policy change, people became more accepting of ideas like waste segregation, and all the resistance that I had to contend with, like what about rats and what about the smell, suddenly melted away. In 2021, the government rolled out the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan 2.0 focused on solid waste management, which, without getting into any facts and figures, is clearly a massive problem we are facing. Several episodes of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Mann Ki Baat have focused on matters connected to the Abhiyan and other environmental matters as well, such as sanitation, cleanliness, and water conservation. While there is a long way to go in terms of the program fully achieving its goals, the policy has undoubtedly left a positive mark on public health and helped alter behavior to some extent in citizens. One of the problematic policy changes made by this government is the amendment made to the biodiversity law of the country that had originally been brought in nearly 20 years ago to protect India's rich biological resources after India acceded to the UN Convention on Biodiversity. These may sound like big words and concepts, but let me give you a simple example. It has been traditional knowledge in India that turmeric or haldi has antiseptic properties, and when we are injured, often the first thing we do is reach out to the box of haldi or turmeric in the kitchen to apply on the wound. Now imagine if someone were to say that they discovered this property of haldi and were to get a patent on it. That's the idea of biopiracy, that is, where an individual or organization uses indigenous biological knowledge and resources for commercial and private gain without permission or compensation to the people to whom the knowledge belongs. Neem was another such example of a commonly known Indian traditional remedy for which a private entity in the West actually sought and obtained a patent. In order to tackle this problem, the Vajpayee government passed a landmark law in 2002 that was hailed as being way ahead of its time. It contained provisions for the fair and equitable sharing of the benefit derived from the use of the biodiversity with the local communities that had actually safeguarded that biodiversity over centuries. The Act also contained a 3-tier structure at the national, state, and local level to ensure the implementation of the provisions. Then in 2016, a writ petition was filed by Baba Ramdev to challenge the right of state biodiversity boards to seek equitable sharing from Indian entities. It is in keeping with the demand of this lobby that in December 2021, the current government proposed comprehensive amendments to the Biological Diversity Act 2002. Under the amendments, no prior approval of the National Biodiversity Authority is required for Indian companies, even if they had foreign stakeholders, to access India's biological resources. The amendment to the law diluted the 3-tier structure of the overseeing committees mentioned before, which would in effect benefit private corporations desiring to use traditional knowledge systems for making their products. You know who they are. While the earlier policy change is a red flag, here's one that is very much the need of the hour. On World Environment Day in 2018, Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced that India would phase out single-use plastics by 2022. Then, in August 2021, the government notified a ban on 19 identified single-use plastic items through its Plastic Waste Management Amendment Rules 2021, which came into force in July 2022. The term single-use plastic was defined as a plastic item intended to be used once for the same purpose before being disposed of or recycled. But the notification banned only a selected list of 19 items. Now, this was undoubtedly a much-needed measure. One doesn't need to be an environmentalist to know that plastic pollution is a major problem today. However, questions have been raised about several other single-use plastic items which have a greater environmental impact that continue to be outside the purview of this ban. Further, experts say that this issue about microns is just hair-splitting and all plastic carry bags should be banned, as has been done in some countries like Tanzania and in our very own state of Himachal Pradesh. Another problem that has been flagged is the lax implementation of the ban, as single-use plastics are still floating around in many parts of India. No matter, it is undoubtedly a positive step in the right direction. One of the big red flags in the last few years has been the amendment to the forest conservation law of the country. In the year 1996, the Supreme Court of India passed a landmark ruling in what is called the Godavarman judgment, where it said that For the purpose of the law, it is not just forests as notified under the Forest Act, which will be regarded as forests, but any land which has natural forests on them are to be regarded as forests. This expanded the scope of the forest protection laws of the country by including vast tracts of land that had not been notified as forests but were called deemed forests because they were covered with natural forest. I hope to do a separate episode on the Godavarman judgment sometime because it deserves an entire episode. But coming back to the amendment brought in by this government in 2023, what it really sought to do was to undo the protection of the Godavarman judgment. The amendment also brought in changes that make it easier for authorities to divert reserved forest areas for commercial and public infrastructure. Checks for diversion of forest land for projects tied to national security and defense within a 100-kilometer radius of border areas were removed. This would include highway projects even in ecologically sensitive and biodiverse areas if they fell in frontier states. Now, you may argue that this provision was needed because defense projects ought not to be delayed waiting for clearances from other departments, especially given an expansionist neighbor like China on one side and a problematic one like Pakistan on the other. In response to that, here's what Dr. Sharath Chandra Lele has to say about that. There is no example in front of us where some incredibly important national security project was enormously delayed because of the Ministry of Environment putting its foot down and saying no. This is just a bogey. The whole story of delay and denial, there is no evidence for it. Further, the list of non-forest activities permitted in forest land was expanded to include various things to suit the interests of rich urban janta like safaris, zoos and ecotourism facilities. When the government announced its decision to bring in this legislation, there were protests held all over the country. Many environmentalists and civil servants opposed it. There was much to debate and discuss. But did that happen? Did you get to hear about this discussion, about the debate, about the bill, about the concerns about our forests vanishing? Likely not, because in July 2023, this is what our media was pummeling you with. That's right. When an important forest law was being tabled in Parliament, our news-turned-entertainment channels were taking much delight in some random love stories, like that's what our life depended on. But before I go on, I must pause to say that this amendment was challenged in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has ruled sometime in February 2024 that the definition of forest as per the Godavarman judgment must be followed till we have a consolidated list of forest land in India. So as of today, the Godavarman judgment and the definition of forest under it still stands. Here's another problematic one. Asian elephants are a Schedule 1 species under the country's Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 and are hence accorded the highest protection of the country. They are also classified as endangered under the IUCN Red List. In 2022, the central government amended the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 and also notified the captive elephant transfer or transport rules in March 2024. The new rules list the process of transferring or transporting elephants and state that elephants can be transferred between individuals or states for religious and other purposes, a provision that the law had not permitted before. An investigative report was recently published by an independent media house named Himal about the Reliance-owned zoo Vantara in Jamnagar, Gujarat, which many of us discovered during the much-reported pre-wedding events of the Ambani family. The report pointed out how the zoo may have acquired more than 200 captive elephants facilitated by these changes to the law. The report also alludes to suspicious means by which Vantara, the Reliance-owned zoo, may have acquired more than 4,000 native and exotic animals and suggests that many animals, including Asian elephants, that were not in need of rescue may have also landed up there. If laws meant for biodiversity and wildlife protection are being changed to favor rich and influential friends of the government, this is something we need to be talking about. Another red flag is the number of changes made to the environment impact assessment norms by this government, which end up diluting them. For starters, what is the EIA? Simply put, an entity interested in setting up or expanding an industrial project is required to go through a process called the EIA, or the Environment Impact Assessment, which studies the impact of the proposed activity or project on the environment before granting clearance for it. Over the last few years, the government has sought to severely dilute this process. For example, one of the processes in the EIA is a public hearing under which an ad is given in local newspapers where concerns of stakeholders, including local residents, are invited and heard. These provisions for public hearing and consultation have been substantially diluted in the amendments. Further, Several exemptions have been made for various industries that would not need a prior environmental clearance at all, which will cover, for instance, the ambitious road expansion in the ecological sensitive mountainous area of Uttarakhand, where we have already seen terrible disasters play out. It has been repeatedly pointed out that the mountainous terrain of certain states make them more ecologically sensitive. From earthquakes to landslides, these areas are more prone to disasters, and one needs to factor these concerns in while planning roads and construction. But the government has thought nothing about brushing them all aside. Promises made in the manifesto to bring Ladakh under the 6th schedule of the constitution are being brazenly flouted. Despite Sonam Wangchuk's 21-day hunger strike, the central government did not as much as respond to the people's demands. The people of Ladakh fear that their land will be given to industrialists, putting at risk their unique way of life. The tribals of Niyamgiri in Odisha, who did not want a bauxite mine in their sacred forests, had to put up a historic fight to resist a powerful corporate like Vedanta from taking their land. Those living in the forests near Hasdev in Chhattisgarh are protesting against the massive tree felling for industrial projects, which is threatening their way of life. Living in a once colonized country, in a post colonial world, we all understand the brutal and long term impact that colonization has had on our land, on our economy, on our resources, and most importantly, on our minds. One is quick to argue that the West has plundered and looted large parts of the world, including Africa and Asia, for centuries, and now that we want to develop, we should not clamp ourselves down by these standards imposed by the West. This argument carries merit and deserves open discussion. But even as we take this perspective vis-a-vis the West, it is worth asking ourselves this question. Are we not doing something similar to people in our own country? Placing natural resources in the hands of a few private individuals for them to fatten their purses is a new form of colonization, and it is important that we call it out for what it is. In 2016-17, an international organization named Global Witness prepared a report called Defenders of the Earth, where they reported on the risks of being an environmental activist in various countries of the world. And India figures on their list as the 4th deadliest country in the world for activists taking up environmental causes. The report mentions a list of activists and Adivasis fighting for their rights who were killed for opposing mining and logging activities. On the one hand, our children are taught in civics lessons in school that according to Article 51A of the Constitution, it is a fundamental duty of citizens to protect and improve the natural environment. But in 2020, when students and youth raised concerns about the changes to the EIA rules that we spoke about in the last point, by sending emails to then Environment Minister Prakash Javadekar through a common portal, their site was blocked, they were issued legal notices and slapped with charges under the UAPA, a law meant for countering terrorism. And once the harassment and intimidation had achieved their purpose, the charges were withdrawn as being a clerical mistake. On the one hand, the might of the government is being used to fatten the purses of the PM's friends, and on the other, it is used to crush the few brave voices that dare to challenge their misdeeds. One of the most dangerous things to have happened under the current regime is the sellout of the mainstream media. While all political parties have had a history of corrupt practices, the media has played its part by raising questions and acting like the voice of the people. But what we see today is a spineless bunch who call themselves journalists but function as cheerleaders, blowing the leader's trumpet on TV news every day, come what may. The Environment Performance Index, that ranks countries on climate change performance based on about 40 metrics like air quality, waste management, and so on every 2 years, placed India at the absolute bottom of the world, 180th position out of 180 countries. Now, the Indian government reacted sharply to the ratings and brushed it aside as biased. Questions were raised about methodology, metrics, and so on. But the important point is this. Given the issues involved are as important as public health, food security, water scarcity, is it not reasonable to expect an informed discussion in the media about it? But these guys are never talking about issues like groundwater and air quality. They are happy to keep us distracted with wedding bashes of rich people and random speculation about aliens and worse. Remember when the tunnel collapse happened in Uttarakhand in early 2024? Environmentalists had repeatedly warned the government not to go ahead with the construction, yet the project went on, inaugurated by the PM himself. And the media was quick to celebrate the rescue without demanding why the disaster was allowed to occur in the first place. Far from asking important questions, the media is engaged in brainwashing us into believing that an emperor who lived 400 years ago is more deserving of our time and attention than the air that we are breathing today. Watching over and facilitating this complete destruction of the fourth pillar of democracy is one of the most damaging actions of this government. Now, of course, there are several other talking points: the controversial Cheetah project, the weakening of the National Green Tribunal, the rolling out of the government's carbon credits program, favoritism shown to certain industrialists and policy changes made to favor them, the status of the tree cover in the country. There are several other points. I have chosen 10 topics to speak about in this video. That is not to say that these are the most important, but these are significant topics that struck me. Do write in with your thoughts. If you'd like to know ground realities and stay updated on environmental matters, if it helps, I've added a list of resources in the description below the video, from long-form articles to comics to podcasts. Pick the format that suits you best. I shall end with a quote by noted environmental lawyer Ritvik Datta, who represented the interests of the tribals in Niyamgiri in the landmark verdict against Vedanta, that brings home really why paying attention to these matters is critical. Victories don't necessarily last in this line of work, but losses in the environment are permanent, yes. And that's the sad part. Thank you for listening to this long episode. Do share it and subscribe to stay posted.